Hello, I'm Professor Fred Long. I'd like to welcome you to Koine Greek Grammar. We're looking at Chapter 16. Here we're going to be looking at vowel stem nouns of the third declension, how they're formed. Then we'll consider some subordinating conjunctions. We'll look at a slightly odd grammatical phenomenon, that is that singular verbs can take neuter plural subjects. Then we'll take a brief look at semantic diagramming and analysis. This method for working with sentences is very productive, but there are some basic principles that students need to learn about modification, and so we'll look briefly at that in this chapter overview right now. First, let's look at the vocabulary. Here we're going to be looking at the last of the third declension nouns. These are vowel stem third declensions, and what will happen is that the endings will be slightly different at times from the standard third declension nouns that you've already learned thus far. As with the other third declension nouns, it's important to understand the genitive form, and so I will read the genitive form as well as the nominative form. E anastasis, tes anastaseos. E dunamis, tes dunameos. E thlipsis, tes thlipseos. E krisis, tes krisios. E pistis, tes pisteos. E polis, tes poleos. To ethnos, tu ethnus. To ethos, tu ethus. To meros, tu merus. To oros, tu orus. To telos, tu telus. Now for the masculine. O archierus, tu archierios. O basileus, tu basileos. O grammateos, tu grammateos. O mouses, tu mouseos. And then an irregular name, O Udas, Judas. Subordinating conjunctions include opu, where, ote, when, os, as, corresponding to, kathos, just as, or corresponding to. Be sure to read the notes on vocabulary, and let's look at third declension nouns of the vowel stem. Basically, there's two types of third declension formations, although these formations can get rather complex, and some grammars will go into greater detail with them. But basically, you have consonant stems and vowel stems. They use basically the same endings, but what happens is that the stem of the noun ends with a vowel, and this will adjust those endings particularly that are vowel endings. So you can see here which ones are going to be affected. The genitive singular form goes to os. The plural form is going to go to is, and the neuter to a. And then also the accusative form, plural, will go to is, or again, for the neuter, to a. Alpha will go to ada. You can see what these forms look like on actual words. Another tricky one is this genitive singular form for the neuter. What's happening is that the os ending, the omicron sigma, is joining with an epsilon to form an omicron upsilon. So here's the complete endings for these vowel stem third declensions. Here you can see the base stem onto which the standard third declension endings are added. Let's consider some subordinating conjunctions. Remember that subordinating conjunctions are those that set up subordinate or dependent clauses, versus coordinating conjunction, which connect relatively equal sentence elements or sentences. So subordinating conjunctions will set up subordinating clauses. Now we've already learned several of these. Oti, e, the conjunction e, meaning if or whether. And now we're just adding more subordinating conjunctions to your repertoire. First is os. Os has three main uses. Os can be used in comparative statements, and the verb will often be implied here. So you'll have a statement made, and then you'll have the os clause, which will be elliptical. Os can also be used to introduce time or temporal clauses, meaning while or when or since in the sense of time. Os can also be used in estimating, and in this use it's used with numbers often and means about. There's some other uses of os. It's a very versatile subordinating conjunction, and one must look at the context to see its basic constraints. Kathos is used very similar to os for estimation. I like to consider kathos as indicating correspondence, and by that, something corresponds to something else in the sense that there's a comparison, there's a likeness about it, but then there's also some support given for what has previously been said. So in Mark 16:7, you will see him there. Well, what is the proof of that? Well, what is the correspondence to that? Well, it's just as he told you. So the seeing will correspond with what was said earlier. So I like to think of kathos as setting and introducing correspondence clauses. Oti is another conjunction of time. It sets up a subordinate clause of time, meaning when. Opu is a subordinating conjunction of location, meaning where. Now, something that can throw students off is when neuter plural subjects will take third singular verbs. This is somewhat common. It's not unusual, so it's something that you can count on seeing every now and again. So here's a couple of examples. The key will be that the neuter noun will be plural. It'll be a neuter noun working with a third singular verb. Well, let's talk about semantic diagramming. This is another type of diagramming method, and the reason I'm introducing it here is because it is extremely fruitful and productive for analysis of a passage, for getting ready to prepare a lesson, for teaching, or for preaching. Basically, you have to work with the text inside of a word processor. That's the best way to do it, is to copy and paste your English or your Greek into a word processor, and then you can manipulate the text. Now, one of the keys to this is that you don't ever need to change the word order. And you're basically asking a couple of questions, two essential questions. First, what are the main constituents or elements in the clause, such as the conjunction, subject, verb, any complements, and then modifiers. So basically you have those 5 aspects of the sentence: conjunction, subject, verb, any object, complements, and then the rest are modifiers. So identify those 5 basic features of the sentence. And then the second question is, what modifies what? What does each modifier contribute to the sentence? And what modifies what? Place it under or above that which it modifies. After doing this diagramming, the next step is semantic analysis, where you actually can discuss and ask questions about and observe what's present in the Greek. How does a modifier modify a particular noun or a particular verb? To consider those kinds of questions. To help facilitate the observation of conjunction, subject, verb, complement, and modifiers, we do some diagramming. And we think in terms of slots or zones, and then also in terms of alignment, and then layering. So those are the 3 basic concepts: zones. And these zones correspond to the basic constituents of the sentence: conjunction, initial, coordinating; subject zone, a verb zone; an object complement zone. And then the modifiers are placed with what they modify. And you have to layer them or other things to fit them into their appropriate slots or zones. So here you can see the zones. To the far left is a verse reference, and then you have conjunction, subject, verb, and then complement. Now you layer the elements by a hard return inside of your word processor, and then you align them into their appropriate slot or zone. Now you do the same thing with modifiers, and you just indent them a little bit to indicate what they're modifying. So here's the zones once again, and there happens to be 2 modifiers here, and one of them is modifying the complement, and the other is modifying the verb. In this method, you don't change the Greek word order. So all you do is you space things into their slots, and if you need a new row, you simply hard return, and then you move things into their appropriate slot or zone. And then you place the modifiers in the same fashion with what they modify. And I use dashes to indicate the different modifiers, and I align them above or below what they modify. Here's an example with John 3:16. Now, here I have a master list of types of modifiers. I think this is helpful for students to think about in terms of adjectival, that is, that which can modify a noun or substantive, adverbial, that which can modify the verbs or adverbs, and then sentential modifiers, that is, those things which connect and interlink sentences together. I worked through several different examples here. So to stoma is the subject. I leave it in an early zone. There's no initial coordinating conjunction, which would be squeezed between here. So I've got a verse reference zone. There's no conjunction zone, and I maybe should have left a slot there for it. Then you have a subject zone, and then a verb zone. And if there were an object, there would be an object zone. But there is no object. Now what that means is that the rest of the sentence elements are modifiers. And so what are the different modifiers? Well, you have a possessive pronoun, our mouth. You have a prepositional phrase modifier, opening to whom, and that would be pros umas, is modifying then the verb. It's possible that you could consider that a kind of object complement, but this is where you put indirect objects, is below and underneath the verb. Then we have a vocative. Now I've included this vocative as modifying umas, because what it's doing here is telling us more information about who the you is. And then we have another sentence, and there's a senditon. Notice there's no conjunction. And then the zones just simply repeat because I'm in another sentence. So each sentence has its own main set of zones, and then you place the modifiers where they may go. Subordinate clauses will set up relative zones. So what that means is that I have the main sentence zones, and then subordinate clauses will align with where they modify, their modifier. So where does that subordinate clause begin, and what does it modify? Does it modify the verb? Then place it underneath the verb, 3 dashes over, and then from that point on, you start those zones again for that subordinate clause. Well, there's a lot of information here. I have some examples for you to practice in English, and then suggested answers, and then I do it again in Greek. And so be sure to work through this material. This is very fun. A lot of good observation comes from this kind of work. And you can see some videos here by typing in those addresses, and you can see me working with English and Greek sentences. Now, the goal of all this is not just to diagram, as fun as that might be. The goal of it really is semantic analysis. And the analysis entails making observation and asking questions about what's present and what's happening in the grammar. Basically, one needs to understand that there are different categories of relationships. And here at Asbury, we teach inductive Bible study, and at the core of that are major structural relationships. Here's a summary of those relationships. You can see these relationships occurring at the sentence and clause level within Greek sentences. And so these should be a part of your repertoire of observational skills when it comes to looking at Greek sentences. You have 4 supporting major structural relationships: inclusio, chiasm, alternation, and intercalation. Now here's another set of lists from Grant Osborne, slightly adapted, and there's going to be overlap here. So different people will have different categories of meaning. These relationships pertain especially to subordinating clauses, and then some to coordinating clauses, and you can add those to your repertoire as well. It's also possible to discuss phrase and miscellaneous modifying relationships. This has been slightly adapted from David Allen Black. So you have location, temporal, direction, purpose, beneficiary, reference, etc. And it goes on to the next page. In modern linguistics, they will make a distinction between argument and adjunct roles. And so here I have a summary of another set of categories that are related to these argument and adjunct role. And you can see them listed here. I worked through an example from Galatians 2, and it's really interesting to study how and where and why, who's referred to, and where they are, and who's affecting who, and whatnot. You can use either paper or computer to make these observations. Often what I'll do is I will do the sentence diagramming with the zones on my computer, and I can make comments if I layer enough. I can make comments inside of brackets on the far left or right of the page, on the far right of the page. It's also possible, once you make the diagram, to print it up, and then you can write all over it. I've had students do this kind of work inside of Excel, and they make beautiful charts. I've had others do it inside of Word or other programs. There's different ways to do it. The big thing is not to spend too much time learning some system of doing it. You can always do it paper and pencil, and it's still just as effective, and it might get you more quickly into it and making significant observation and asking those significant questions. I have other examples that you can look at here, as well as analysis and my discussion there. There's a checkpoint, so you can practice this yourself and compare it with my answer. So be sure to read then the case in point, which discusses the love command in John 13.